Would you like to try that again in a language you actually understand, or should I help you order properly? The words hadn't been spoken yet, but they were already waiting somewhere in the room, hanging invisibly between polished silverware and quiet judgment, as Richard Whitmore leaned back in his chair with the faintest smirk curling at the edge of his lips, his voice cutting cleanly through the soft jazz and low conversations of the upscale Manhattan restaurant as he began speaking in rapid, overly embellished Italian, each syllable exaggerated just enough to draw attention without seeming obvious. Or at least that's what he thought, because a few nearby diners glanced over, curious, impressed, or simply entertained, while the manager near the bar subtly stiffened, recognizing that tone, that performance, that quiet kind of humiliation dressed up as sophistication, and across from him stood Ava Brooks, her posture straight but relaxed, her hands gently clasped around her order pad, her expression unreadable, not confused, not intimidated, just still, as if she were listening to something far more important than the words themselves, as if she were measuring the intention behind them, and for a brief moment, the world seemed to slow, the clink of glasses fading into the background, the golden chandelier light settling like a held breath over the room, because this wasn't just an order, it was a test, and Richard knew it. He had done this before, in cities across the country, in places where accents were currency and knowledge was a weapon. He enjoyed the shift in power, the subtle way people stumbled when he chose to elevate himself just out of reach, and now he watched Ava closely, expecting hesitation, expecting that flicker of uncertainty, that small stumble that would confirm what he already believed, that she didn't belong in his world, that she would play her part and quietly retreat, but Ava didn't move, not immediately, not in the way he expected. Instead, she let the silence stretch just long enough to make the table next to them pause their conversation. Just long enough for the air to tighten, and then she lifted her eyes, calm, steady, meeting his without challenge but without submission either, and when she finally spoke, her voice was smooth, precise, and unmistakably fluent, responding in the same language, correcting not just his order but the structure of his sentence with a softness that felt almost generous, as if she were offering him dignity he hadn't offered her, and something shifted, subtle at first, a ripple through the room. A quiet awareness that what had just happened wasn't ordinary, because she didn't stop there. She continued, still in that same language, explaining the dish he had tried to order, its regional origin, the traditional preparation, the detail he had gotten wrong, and suddenly the performance wasn't his anymore, it belonged to her, and Richard's smile faltered, just slightly, barely noticeable, but enough, because the room had changed, the attention that had once hovered around him now leaned toward her, drawn by something quieter but far more powerful, and Ava, still composed, added one final sentence, gentle but unmistakable, before switching back to English, her tone respectful, professional, offering to place the correct order for him, as if nothing unusual had happened at all, as if she hadn't just dismantled the entire illusion he had carefully built in less than a minute, and in that stillness that followed, in that rare, heavy silence where no one quite knew what to say, Richard Whitmore realized, for the first time in a very long time, that he was no longer the most impressive person in the room. The silence did not break right away, it settled, thick and deliberate, like a weight pressing gently against every table in the room, and for a moment no one reached for their glass or checked their phone, because something subtle but undeniable had just shifted, and even those who had not heard every word could feel it, that quiet reversal, that invisible line that had been crossed without anyone raising their voice. And Richard Whitmore felt it more than anyone, though he would not show it. Not yet, because men like him did not react, they recalibrated, they adjusted the narrative in real time, and so he leaned forward slightly, folding his hands on the table with controlled precision, his expression smoothing back into something practiced and composed, as if the moment had not caught him off guard at all, as if he had planned it this way, as if this had been nothing more than a small, harmless exchange. Impressive, he said at last, his tone light, almost amused, but there was a tightness beneath it, something just barely contained. You must have memorized a few phrases. And a faint chuckle followed from somewhere behind him, uncertain, testing the room, trying to decide which side of the moment to stand on, because the balance had not fully settled yet, and Ava heard it, every layer of it, the attempt to pull the moment back under his control, to shrink what had just happened into something smaller, something explainable, something that would allow him to remain untouched. And still she did not rush, she did not push, she did not react the way he expected. Instead she gave a small nod, polite, acknowledging the comment without accepting its weight, her pen resting lightly against the edge of her notepad as if she had all the time in the world, and when she spoke again, her voice was steady, measured. "I studied it for a long time," she said, simple, direct, leaving no space for dismissal, and something in the way she said it made the words land differently, not defensive, not proud, just true, and Richard's eyes flickered, just for a fraction of a second. Because that was not the answer he had prepared for, not the tone, not the calm, and he shifted slightly in his chair, the leather creaking softly beneath him, a small, almost imperceptible sound that seemed louder than it should have been. "Well," he continued, clearing his throat just enough to reset his voice, "then perhaps you can recommend something better than what I ordered." And there it was again, the attempt to reframe, to regain authority, to make this feel like his choice, his invitation, his control. And Ava saw it clearly, the edges of it, the structure behind it, and still she met it with the same quiet composure, stepping just slightly to the side so that the light from above caught her face differently, illuminating her eyes in a way that made them seem sharper, more present, and she began to speak, not quickly, not dramatically, but with a clarity that drew attention without demanding it, describing a dish not just by its name but by its story, where it came from, how it was meant to be prepared, the balance of flavors, the intention behind each ingredient. And as she spoke, the room leaned in again, not because she asked it to, but because she gave them something real, something grounded, something that did not need to prove itself. And Richard listened, though he had not planned to, his gaze fixed on her now in a way that was no longer performative, no longer distant, but searching, recalculating, trying to understand where he had misjudged the equation, because this was not how it usually went, this was not the script he knew. And when she finished, she did not wait for approval, she did not look around for reaction, she simply offered a small, respectful smile and asked, "Would you like me to place that order for you?" As if the decision had always been his, as if she had not just guided him there step by step, and for the first time since he had sat down, Richard Whitmore hesitated, not visibly, not in a way most people would catch, but enough that the moment stretched just a second longer than it should have, and in that second, in that quiet space between question and answer, something unfamiliar settled in his chest, something he could not immediately name. Not embarrassment, not quite, but something close. Something that felt like being seen more clearly than he had intended, and when he finally nodded, the motion was small, almost reluctant, and the room, though it returned to its usual rhythm, did not feel the same as it had before. The order was placed, the moment had passed, and yet it lingered, not in the words that had been spoken, but in the space they had reshaped, and as Ava stepped away from the table, her movements remained steady, unhurried, as if nothing unusual had happened at all, but behind her, the air still carried that subtle shift, that quiet awareness that something had been revealed without being announced, and Richard Whitmore sat back once more, though this time the posture felt different, less anchored, less certain, his fingers resting against the edge of the table as his gaze followed her for just a second longer than he intended before he looked away, as if catching himself in something he did not want to examine too closely, and around him the restaurant resumed its rhythm, the low hum of conversation returning, glasses clinking softly, a server passing by with a tray that caught the warm overhead light. But even as everything appeared normal, there was a difference in the way a few heads turned, in the way a couple at the next table spoke more quietly now, their earlier amusement replaced with something more thoughtful, because moments like that did not disappear, they settled into the room, changing its tone in ways that could not be undone, and Richard reached for his water, taking a slow sip, buying himself a second to reset, to reconstruct the version of himself he preferred to occupy, the one that did not hesitate, the one that controlled the room without effort, and yet when he set the glass down, the faintest trace of that hesitation remained, like a shadow he could not fully step out of, and he adjusted his cuff, a small, habitual gesture, precise, controlled, as if order could be restored through detail, but his mind did not settle as easily, it replayed the exchange, not the words, but the tone, the calm, the way she had not reacted the way he expected, the way she had not needed to, and that was what unsettled him most. Not that she had known the language, but that she had not used it to elevate herself above him. She had simply stood where she was, unshaken, and allowed the truth to do the work, and that kind of confidence was unfamiliar to him, because it did not ask for recognition, it did not compete, it did not bend, and before he could follow that thought any further, the table shifted slightly as another presence approached, the manager. His expression carefully neutral, professional, but with a subtle edge of attentiveness that had not been there before. "Is everything to your satisfaction, sir?" he asked, his tone respectful, but there was something else beneath it, something observant, as if he too, had witnessed the moment and was now measuring its aftermath, and Richard gave a short nod, smooth, controlled. "Yes, everything is fine," he replied, his voice returning to its usual cadence, confident, even, and the manager held his gaze for just a fraction longer than necessary before nodding back and stepping away, and for a brief second, Richard felt it again, that unfamiliar sensation of being assessed rather than admired, and he shifted in his seat, exhaling slowly through his nose. Telling himself it was nothing, that this was insignificant, that he had been in far more complex situations than a simple exchange in a restaurant, but the mind does not always follow logic, and his did not let it go so easily, because somewhere beneath the surface, a question had begun to form, quiet but persistent, not about her, but about himself, about why he had needed that moment in the first place, why he had chosen to create it, and before he could answer it, Ava returned, not with hesitation, not with caution, but with the same composed presence, setting down the water he had not asked for but now found himself appreciating, followed by a small plate of freshly baked bread, the steam rising gently, carrying with it a warmth that felt almost out of place against the cool edge of his thoughts, and she did not linger, did not look to see if he would speak, she simply did what she had come to do with quiet precision. And as she turned to leave, Richard spoke again, the words coming before he had fully decided on them. "Where did you learn it?" he asked, his tone different now, less performative, more direct, and Ava paused, just briefly, not surprised, not uncomfortable, just present, and when she looked back at him, there was no hesitation in her answer, only clarity. "From someone who believed I should never feel small in any room," she said, and then she stepped away, leaving the words behind her. Not as a challenge, not as a lesson, but as a simple truth, and this time, when the silence settled again, it did not feel heavy, it felt precise, like something had finally landed exactly where it needed to. Richard did not look down at the table this time, he kept his eyes on the space where she had stood just seconds ago, as if the answer she left behind had not finished unfolding yet, and the words echoed in a way that felt quieter than sound but heavier than silence, "From someone who believed I should never feel small in any room," and for the first time that evening, he did not have an immediate response, not a clever remark, not a polished deflection, not even a subtle shift of control, just a pause, real and unguarded, and it unsettled him in a way he could not easily categorize, because it was not confrontation, it was not embarrassment, it was something closer to recognition, the kind that arrives without permission and refuses to leave quietly, and he leaned back slowly, exhaling through his nose, his gaze lowering just enough to focus on the reflection of the overhead light against the polished surface of his glass, as if clarity might be found there. But it did not come in the way he expected, instead it came in fragments, small details he had ignored before, the steadiness in her voice, the absence of defensiveness, the way she had not tried to impress anyone, and that was the part that lingered, because everything he had done had been designed to impress, to assert, to establish distance, and yet she had done the opposite, and still held the room without effort, and that realization did not sit comfortably, it pressed against something deeper, something he had not examined in years, if ever, and the arrival of the first course interrupted that thought, a server placing the dish carefully in front of him with practiced precision, the aroma rising immediately, warm, layered, unmistakably rich, and for a moment he focused on that instead, the tangible, the immediate, something he could evaluate, something he understood, and he picked up his fork, cutting into the dish with the same measured control he applied to everything else, but as he took the first bite, the experience was different than expected, not because the food was extraordinary, though it was, but because it carried something else now, context, intention, a story he had not asked for but had been given anyway, and he paused, just slightly, the fork hovering for a fraction longer than necessary before lowering it back to the plate, and across the room, Ava moved from table to table with the same quiet rhythm, checking in, adjusting, listening, never rushing, never lingering too long, and there was a consistency in it, a kind of presence that did not fluctuate based on who she was serving, and that detail, small as it was, caught his attention again, because it meant something. It meant she was not reacting to him, she was simply being herself, and that shifted the equation entirely, because it removed the framework he was used to, the one where every interaction could be measured, influenced, controlled, and without that framework, he found himself without the usual reference points, and he did not like that feeling, not at first, but he could not ignore it either, and when she returned once more to check on the table, her expression the same, composed, attentive, he spoke again, though this time there was no performance in no edge, just a directness that felt unfamiliar even to him. Was that someone a teacher? He asked, his tone quieter now, more grounded, and Ava tilted her head slightly, considering the question not as something to answer quickly, but as something to answer honestly, and when she spoke, her voice carried that same calm clarity. No, she said gently, she cleaned offices at night and studied languages on her lunch break. And there was no embellishment, no attempt to dramatize it, just the truth placed simply in the space between them, and something in Richard's expression shifted again, not visibly to most, but enough that the distance he had tried to maintain earlier felt thinner now, less defined, and he glanced down at his plate before looking back up, as if recalibrating not just the moment, but something larger, something that extended beyond the walls of the restaurant, and for the first time that evening, the silence that followed was not something he tried to fill. It was something he allowed to exist, because he was beginning to understand that not every moment needed to be controlled, and not every person needed to be measured against him, and as Ava stepped away once more, the room felt different again, not because anything dramatic had happened, but because something quiet and undeniable had begun to change, and this time, he did not resist it. The rhythm of the evening continued, but for Richard Whitmore, it no longer felt like something he was directing, it felt like something he was stepping into for the first time without a script, and that difference, subtle as it was, followed him with every bite, every glance, every second that passed between interactions, and he found himself slowing down in ways he usually did not allow, noticing details he would have dismissed before, the way the soft lighting reflected off the glassware in uneven patterns, the quiet coordination between servers moving through narrow spaces without collision, the low hum of conversation that rose and fell like a tide rather than a competition, and in the center of it, Ava Brooks moved with the same steady presence, not seeking attention, not avoiding it, simply existing in a way that felt complete on its own, and that completeness unsettled him more than any challenge ever had. Because it did not rely on him, it did not respond to him, it did not adjust for him, and as that realization settled in, he placed his fork down slowly, his appetite no longer driven by habit but by something more reflective, and he leaned back slightly, his gaze shifting once again toward her as she paused near another table, listening to an elderly couple with the same level of attention she had given him, nodding gently, offering a quiet smile that felt real, not rehearsed, and something about that consistency pressed against him, because it revealed something he had overlooked, that what he had experienced was not an exception, it was who she was, and that meant the moment earlier had not been about proving him wrong, it had been about remaining herself regardless of him, and that distinction carried weight, more than he expected, and when she turned and caught his gaze again, there was no hesitation, no discomfort, just acknowledgement, as if he were simply another part of the room, no more, no less, and that neutrality, that quiet equality, shifted something deeper inside him, something he had not allowed in a long time, and without fully planning it, he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, pulling out a sleek card holder, his fingers pausing for a moment as if reconsidering the intention behind the gesture, because this was familiar territory, this was how he usually closed moments, with a gesture of power, with an offer, with something that placed him back in control, and yet now, as he looked at the card between his fingers, it felt different. Insufficient somehow, like it belonged to a version of the moment that no longer existed, and he hesitated, longer than he would ever admit, before sliding the card back into place, his hand lingering there for just a second as if acknowledging the choice he had just made, and instead of reaching for the familiar, he waited, and when Ava approached once more, not because he signaled her, but because the timing of the service naturally brought her back, he met her presence with something quieter, something less defined. The dish was excellent, he said, and the words, simple as they were, carried a sincerity that had not been there earlier, not layered with expectation, not shaped for effect, just stated, and Ava nodded slightly, accepting the comment without expanding it, without turning it into something more than it was. "I am glad," she replied, her tone warm but grounded, and for a moment, they stood there in a kind of balance that had not existed before, not customer and server, not power and response, just two people sharing a moment that did not need to be elevated or diminished, and Richard felt that balance settle in a way that surprised him, because it did not diminish him, it clarified something, something about the space between people, something about what it meant to be seen without performance, and as Ava prepared to step away again, he spoke once more, this time not to test, not to challenge, but to understand. "Do you still study?" he asked, and Ava paused. Her expression unchanged, but her eyes reflecting a quiet depth that suggested the question had meaning beyond its surface, and she nodded. "Every day," she said, and there was no hesitation, no doubt. Just certainty, and as she moved on, those two words remained with him, not as information, but as a reflection, because for the first time in a long time, Richard Whitmore found himself asking a question he could not answer immediately, not about her, but about himself, about what he had stopped learning, about what he had replaced growth with, and as the evening continued around him, unchanged for everyone else, he sat there in that quiet realization, aware that something small had shifted. But also knowing that it was not small at all. The question did not leave him after she walked away, it stayed, quiet but persistent, echoing beneath the surface of everything else. Do you still study? And more importantly, why did he stop? And Richard Whitmore sat there with that thought longer than he had intended, his fingers resting lightly against the edge of the table as the restaurant continued around him, unchanged, uninterrupted. But for him something had shifted in a way that could not be ignored, because the question had not been about language, it had been about discipline, about curiosity, about something he once had but had slowly traded for certainty, and certainty, he realized now, had a cost. It closed doors quietly, it replaced questions with assumptions, it turned growth into maintenance, and for years he had mistaken that for success, and as he leaned back slightly, his gaze drifting once again across the room, he saw Ava in a way he had not seen her before, not as a server, not as a moment, but as a pattern, a person moving through her responsibilities with intention, with consistency, with a kind of quiet commitment that did not fluctuate based on who was watching, and that steadiness stood in contrast to something he was beginning to recognize in himself, a tendency to perform, to adjust, to assert control even when it was not necessary, and the realization did not arrive all at once, it unfolded slowly, like a lens coming into focus, revealing details that had always been there but had gone unnoticed, and when his plate was cleared and the next course arrived, he barely registered it at first, his mind still tracing that thread, still pulling at that quiet question, and it was not until Ava returned again, setting the dish down with the same precise care, that his attention fully returned to the present, and this time when he looked at her, there was no calculation in it, no strategy, just observation, genuine and unguarded. What are you working toward? He asked, and the question came out more directly than he expected, not softened, not disguised, just honest, and Ava paused, just for a moment, not because she did not have an answer, but because she chose to give one that mattered, and when she spoke, her voice carried that same calm certainty he had begun to recognize. Translation, she said, I want to work with people who do not get heard because no one understands them, and the words settled differently than anything else she had said that evening, because they revealed not just skill, but purpose, and Richard felt that settle somewhere deeper. Somewhere that did not respond to logic or strategy, but to something more fundamental, something he had not engaged with in a long time, and he nodded slowly, absorbing it, not as a statement to evaluate, but as something to consider, something that stood on its own without needing validation, and for a brief moment, neither of them spoke, the space between them no longer filled with tension or expectation, but with something quieter, something more balanced, and when Ava stepped away again, the absence of her presence felt noticeable in a way it had not before, not because she commanded attention, but because she carried something consistent that left an impression when it moved on, and Richard sat with that, allowing it to exist without immediately defining it, without trying to reduce it to something manageable, and as he reached for his glass once more, he realized that for the first time in a very long time, he was not thinking about what came next in terms of control or advantage. He was thinking about what came next in terms of change, and that thought, unfamiliar as it was, did not feel threatening, it felt necessary, and as the evening moved forward, as the soft music continued and the quiet conversations filled the room, Richard Whitmore sat in a place he had not occupied in years, a place where he was not the center of the room, not the one shaping the moment, but simply part of it, and in that shift, subtle and internal, something began to take root, not loud, not dramatic, but steady, like the beginning of something that would not disappear when he walked out the door, something that would follow him long after the check was paid and the lights of the restaurant faded behind him, something that would ask him, again and again, a question he could no longer ignore, what are you still learning? And for the first time, he was not sure he had a good answer. The question lingered in the air long after she walked away, not because it demanded an answer, but because it had already begun to reshape something inside him, and Richard Whitmore sat there, still, his hands resting loosely on the table as the quiet rhythm of the restaurant continued around him, unchanged yet somehow distant, as if he were observing it from a place just slightly removed, and for the first time in years, He was not thinking about the next deal, the next meeting, the next strategic move. He was thinking about something far less structured and far more difficult to quantify: purpose, not the kind that could be measured in profit or influence, but the kind that guided choices when no one was watching. And that realization settled into him slowly, like a truth he had always known but had chosen not to examine too closely. And across the room, Ava continued her work, moving with that same quiet intention, her presence neither shrinking nor expanding based on the people around her, and he noticed how consistent it was, how it did not fluctuate with status or expectation. And that consistency carried weight, because it suggested something deeper than skill. It suggested identity, and that was something he had spent years refining externally while leaving it untouched internally. And when the final course arrived, he barely registered the details at first. His attention divided between the present moment and the quiet unfolding of thought beneath it. But as he took a bite, he slowed again, allowing himself to actually experience it rather than move through it. And that simple act, that intentional pause, felt unfamiliar in its own way, because it required him to stop performing even for himself. And when Ava returned once more, this time to clear the table and prepare for the close of the meal, he looked at her with a different kind of awareness, not searching for something to challenge or evaluate, but recognizing something he had not seen before. And his voice, when he spoke, carried that shift, softer, more grounded. "You are very good at what you do," he said. And the words were not meant as a compliment in the usual sense. They were an acknowledgement, simple and direct, and Ava met them with the same steady composure, a small nod, a quiet thank you, nothing more, nothing less. And that restraint, that lack of need to expand or perform, reinforced what he was beginning to understand, that her value was not dependent on recognition. It existed independently of it. And as she gathered the last of the plates, he reached for the check when it arrived, glancing at the total without reaction. The numbers familiar, insignificant in the context of his life, but the moment itself no longer felt transactional, it felt reflective. And he paused again, pen in hand, considering something that had not crossed his mind in years, not how much to leave, but what the gesture actually meant. And for a moment, he thought about writing something, a note, an explanation, something that could articulate the shift he was experiencing, but the words did not come easily, not because they were not there, but because they did not need to be said in that way. And instead, he signed the receipt, leaving a tip that was generous but not performative, not exaggerated, just intentional. And when he set the pen down, he felt a quiet sense of completion, not of the meal, but of something internal that had begun to realign. And as Ava returned one final time to collect the folder, their eyes met again, and this time there was no tension, no imbalance, just a brief, mutual acknowledgement of a moment that had unfolded in ways neither of them had planned. And as he stood to leave, adjusting his jacket with a familiar motion that now felt slightly different, he paused for just a second, looking at her not as someone passing through his evening, but as someone who had, in a quiet and unexpected way, changed its direction. And though he did not say it out loud, the understanding was there, clear and settled, that this had not been about language, or food, or even the exchange itself. It had been about something much simpler and much more difficult, learning how to see without needing to be seen. And as he turned and walked toward the exit, the soft light of the restaurant fading behind him, that realization stayed with him, steady and unresolved, like the beginning of a question he would carry far beyond this room. The night air outside was cooler than he expected, carrying that quiet New York hum of distant traffic and muted conversations drifting along the sidewalk. And as the glass door closed behind him, Richard Whitmore paused for just a moment, his hand still resting lightly against the polished handle as if something inside the restaurant had not fully let go of him yet. And for a man who was always moving, always transitioning from one place to the next with practiced efficiency, that pause was unfamiliar, almost out of character. But he did not rush it. He allowed it, standing there beneath the soft glow of the exterior lights as the reflection of the city flickered faintly across the glass. And for a brief second, he caught his own image, sharp suit, composed posture, everything exactly as it had been when he walked in. And yet something about it felt different now, not visually, not in any measurable way, but internally, as if the structure remained the same while the meaning beneath it had shifted. And he exhaled slowly, stepping away from the door and onto the sidewalk, the steady rhythm of the city meeting him again, paxes passing, footsteps echoing, a distant siren fading into the background. And usually that movement grounded him, it reconnected him to the pace he understood, the one he controlled. But tonight it felt slightly out of sync, as if he were moving through it rather than directing it. and his driver, already waiting by the curb, stepped forward. Quickly, opening the door with a nod that was both respectful and efficient. "Good evening, sir," he said, but Richard did not respond immediately, his attention still half turned toward the restaurant behind him, not out of nostalgia, not out of curiosity, but out of something quieter, something unresolved, and when he finally moved, lowering himself into the back seat, the leather cool beneath him, he did not reach for his phone, did not check the next item on his schedule, did not fill the silence with the usual routines that kept everything in motion. Instead he sat back, looking out the window as the car pulled away from the curb, the restaurant growing smaller in the reflection, and yet the moment inside did not fade with it, it stayed, not as a memory, but as a question that had not finished unfolding, and as the city lights passed in soft streaks across the glass, he found himself replaying not the conversation, but the feeling, that shift in balance, that quiet certainty in her voice when she spoke about purpose, about not allowing herself to feel small, and it echoed differently now, outside the context of the room, because here, in the quiet space of the moving car, stripped of performance and audience, it became something more personal, something directed inward rather than outward, and he leaned his head slightly back against the seat, closing his eyes for just a second as if to settle the thought, but it did not settle, it expanded, connecting to things he had not considered in years, moments when he had chosen certainty over curiosity, control over growth, image over substance, and none of those choices had felt wrong at the time, they had felt necessary, strategic, but now, in contrast to something so simple, so grounded, they felt incomplete, and that realization did not come with regret, it came with clarity, and clarity, he knew, was something that could not be ignored once it arrived, and as the car slowed at a red light, the city pausing just briefly around him, he opened his eyes again, his gaze shifting to the reflection in the window, his own image layered faintly over the passing lights, and for the first time in a long time, he did not see a finished version of himself, he saw something still in progress, something not yet defined, and that thought, unfamiliar as it was, did not feel uncomfortable, it felt necessary, like the beginning of a direction he had not known he needed, and as the light turned green and the car moved forward again, carrying him deeper into the city, the question remained with him, steady and unresolved, not demanding an answer, but refusing to be dismissed. And somewhere beneath the surface of everything he had built, everything he had maintained, something new had begun, not loud, not immediate, but real, and it followed him into the night without asking permission. The city did not slow down for reflection, it never did, and yet for Richard Whitmore, something within that constant motion had shifted into a quieter rhythm, one that followed him long after the car came to a stop outside his building, the towering glass structure rising into the night like a symbol of everything he had built and everything he had believed defined him, and as the driver stepped out to open the door, Richard remained seated for a moment longer, his hand resting lightly against the armrest, his gaze fixed not on the entrance ahead but on the faint reflection of himself in the darkened window, and for the first time in years, he did not see certainty, he saw possibility, unfinished, undefined, and that realization stayed with him as he finally stepped out, the cool air brushing against his face as he straightened his jacket out of habit, though the gesture felt less automatic now, more conscious, as if he were aware of the role it played rather than simply performing it. And inside, the lobby was exactly as he expected, polished marble floors, soft lighting, a quiet nod from the concierge who knew him by name, everything in its place, everything predictable, and yet he moved through it differently, not with the usual forward momentum, but with a subtle awareness of each step, each interaction, each detail that he had once overlooked because it had always been there, and when he reached the elevator, he pressed the button and waited, not checking his phone, not filling the silence, just standing there in a moment that did not demand anything from him, and as the doors opened and he stepped inside, the mirrored walls reflecting him from multiple angles, he caught his own gaze again, and this time he did not look away, because something about that reflection felt less like an image to maintain and more like a question to answer, and the elevator rose smoothly, floor by floor, the soft hum beneath his feet marking the passage of time in a way that felt more deliberate than usual, and with each passing second, the thought returned, not forcefully, but steadily, like a quiet voice that had finally found space to be heard. What are you still learning? And he let the question remain, did not rush to answer it, did not try to resolve it into something simple, because he understood now that its value was not in the answer, but in the direction it pointed, and when the doors opened again, revealing the quiet hallway leading to his apartment, he stepped out with that awareness still intact. not fading, not diminishing, but settling into something that felt like the beginning of change rather than the end of a moment. And inside his apartment, everything was as it had always been: clean lines, carefully chosen furniture, a space designed for control and precision. But tonight it felt different, not because anything had changed physically, but because he had, even if only slightly. And he walked toward the large window overlooking the city, the lights stretching endlessly into the distance, each one representing a life, a story, a perspective beyond his own. And he stood there for a long moment, hands resting loosely at his sides, no urgency, no distraction, just presence. And in that quiet, the memory of Ava Brooks returned, not as a single moment, but as a series of small, consistent truths: her steadiness, her purpose, her refusal to become smaller in a space that expected her to be. And he realized that what had stayed with him was not what she knew, but how she carried it, without performance, without need for validation, simply as part of who she was. And that understanding settled into him with a clarity that did not need to be spoken, because it was already shaping something inside him, something that would influence the next decision, the next interaction, the next moment. He chose curiosity over certainty, growth over control. And as he looked out over the city, the reflection of his own image faintly visible against the glass, he understood that the evening had not changed the world around him, but it had changed the way he would move through it. And that shift, quiet as it was, carried more weight than anything he could have orchestrated, because it was real. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough.